And they really should have a mindset that I may be about once a year in a position where I may be fired. Right? Because you're trying new things. Things don't happen as fast as you want. No one knows how to plan, right? Because how do you plan something which can grow 500% or negative 10%? I mean, both of them are possible when you're trying something risky. So it does require a mindset to say, I'm willing to take those risks, not ridiculous risks, but some measured risks. But I don't know if it'll come off in a year or two. Sometimes it takes 3 years.
This is Task Time Energy, the purpose-filled productivity podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Welcome to the show. Welcome, everyone. Our guest today, Ganesh Venkataramanan, is the Vice President of Presales of a leading industrial software company. He has over 20 years of experience in the simulation and training domain and has a proven track record of growing internal businesses from less than $1 million to over $50 million by building talented teams and systems that enable rapid execution. Ganesh is also the author of a fictional book titled Let Me Into Heaven, that explores the journey of three computer scientists chasing the truth. Ganesh has some great thoughts to share about finding purpose and meaning in life, about creating useful habits that help us reach goals, and about leading successful teams. One reason that I really enjoyed this conversation with Ganesh is because I'm very interested in the juxtaposition of science and religion. So I'm not a Christian. As a kid growing up, I went to church every week. And then as a teenager, I stopped going and I walked away from those particular beliefs that I grew up with. Today, I might describe myself as happily agnostic. Or to quote one of my favorite movies, Air America, I did say that I was a Buddhist. I didn't say that I was a good one. So if you're the kind of person who will turn a show off and switch to something else if someone starts talking about religion, I get it. But these days, when people's views seem so polarized, and so many people are gravitating towards extreme views, and even those of us who consider ourselves open-minded sometimes retreat into the comfort of our safe spaces, I think it's important to listen to people who say, I know you don't believe what I believe, and I totally respect that. We can still meet each other as equals, and there are things that we can learn from each other. When we encounter people with that attitude, I think we should look for opportunities to learn from each other and understand each other better. If we're going to survive and thrive on this planet, we need to understand each other better. And we need to learn how to create connections with people who see the world differently than we do. Ganesh, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
We were talking a little bit beforehand about some topics that might be interesting to discuss, considering your background and your interests. One of the things we were talking about was purpose, which is a big focus of this podcast. And you were talking about how your faith helped you find a lot of purpose in your life. And, like I mentioned, I'm not a Christian. This is not a Christian podcast, but I still think it's very interesting when people find a sense of purpose through their faith. It's really interesting to hear about that and the impacts that has on someone's life. If you wouldn't mind, would you tell us a little bit about how that came about for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And let me first thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about a thorny topic, right? It's not everybody's favorite topic, right? But such was my journey. And so, I just want to make sure I do justice to that. As going through college, I was an atheist. And somewhere along the way, I was trying to understand what is my purpose? What is it that I want to accomplish, right? What is the meaning of life? I think at some point in everyone's life, they do ask themselves those questions, right? And I had this uneasy feeling that perhaps I wouldn't be able to come up with a purpose. Not only that I didn't have one, but I wouldn't be able to think of one, And so that stuck with me. And as I thought through different purposes, and some of them had to do with my career and what I wanted to accomplish, etc., they all, to me, seemed very me-focused. How much money can I make? What title can I get to? And so on. And when I made the money and the titles to the extent that I did, it still didn't seem super fulfilling. It still felt like there was a hole somewhere that I didn't know how to fill. I went through a journey, and my interest is in the intersection of science and faith. I'm an engineer by background. I'm a chemical engineer, and I loved understanding if there was an intersection of science and faith. And going along that journey is how I became a Christian. I was actually a lawyer who had written a book who took me along this path of where I chose to be a Christian at the end of it. And my first step in that process was say, okay, let me now come up with a purpose. Now I'll include God in my purpose. And I went through that until I matured a little bit more, and then came to the conclusion that it was actually the other way around. I had to be part of God's purpose instead of God being part of my purpose. And when Jesus was asked, what should we do to have life? And one of the very interesting comments he made was he only talked about 2 commandments. Everyone talks about the 10 commandments that Moses came up with. He came up with 2. The first one was love your God with all your heart and all your mind. And I stopped at that point and said, all your mind. This is the first time, to me, the mind is the analytical part of who we are. And so, wait, he wants me to not check my brain out when I enter a church, but he used my brains to understand my purpose. So as I started going deeper into in my purpose, started saying, I'm not the first person to struggle with this conflict or this supposed conflict between science and faith. Is there really a conflict? Does there need to be a conflict, or are they, perhaps 2 sides of the same coin, or are they pointing to the same thing? So as I started going in there and using my mind and my brains, as it were, to understand God better, that led to the second of his commandments, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And which is a hard thing to do because we love ourselves quite a bit. And it's hard to love anyone else with the same magnitude, I think. And so, but I wanted to share then saying, I'm not the only one who went down this path trying to sync up science and faith, so to speak. I think there's others asking the same questions when it comes to purpose. And I want to share it with them. Obviously, it's not relevant to everyone because not everyone on the podcast is a Christian, or not everyone even believes in God, right? For those who do, I think it's a missing piece of the puzzle, because if they start from there, then I think they will find great value in that purpose. For those who don't, then I say just ignore it and we go on to the next part of this podcast. Take what is relevant, right? Obviously, I'm not here to hurt feelings, and it's a difficult topic. But yeah, I think it also needs to be shared for those who it is relevant.
You call it a thorny topic. And I think for a lot of people it is. And I think a lot of people have that idea that if you're going to be a Christian, if you're going to be a religious person, that means leaving your brain at the door, right? And not being able to be as thoughtful, analytical. What I always find interesting is when you look back through history, you look at people like Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton. And when you learn about their lives, they were very devoutly religious people, right, who also happened to be the great scientists of their time.
Right. If we look at, it's interesting you bring up Newton, and Newton's book was a goal at helping people understand the character of God, but through the eyes of physics, right? And I think that is often lost. The basis for science as we know it today is a large part of it is a Judeo-Christian background. And they understood God to be an intelligible being, and so expected the world to be rational and to be able to be explored, right? Mm-hmm. But they also understood that we may be valuable as people, but we're also flawed. We can fake ourselves out. And that led to the scientific method, which says that it had to be repeatable and reproducible. And it's not just one person who can see it, but anyone can repeat the experiments and see it. So that was a lot of a background to where science came from. Obviously, a lot of cultures have had background in science as well, since they expected it to be intelligible. It led to a growth in technology, but which we probably didn't see with any of the other civilizations over the many, many years. So Stephen Meyer has written a brilliant book on this called The Return of the God Hypothesis, and he's a brilliant scientist who's written on this topic. So for those who are interested, that would be a great starting point.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Especially today in our society today, we often see things as in conflict with each other.
Right.
And to be able to look at people like Newton who were able to reconcile those two things to whatever degree, he was able to, where the science was very clear for him, right, and the purpose of science was very clear, or the methods of science were very clear. And yet the motivation, the purpose that drove him to do all that hard work was his faith. That seems to be, for people who can reconcile those two things, that seems to be a common connection.
Yeah. I've always felt you can find God in engineering, in science, in math, which I've always loved, in music, right? So there's various expressions, which all eventually seems to have a common purpose behind it, and who we call God, I believe, right? And there is actually a word. There's a unity behind the diversity, which led to the word university, right? Which is, the whole intent of it was to say there seems to be an underlying unity behind all these different areas of great interest to us as human beings. So that interesting, right?
It is, yeah, that is very interesting. I'm curious about some of the ways that you've seen this impact your life. Mm-hmm. So you found your Christian faith. It gave you a great sense of purpose in your life. And what are some of the results of that?
Yeah. So, one of the things I wanted to explore was this integration between science and faith, right? And as I started doing it, I said, I'm going to write. First, I was just going to take notes for me to remember, right? And then at some point I said, I'm going to write a book about this because I'm sure I'm not the only one asking these questions. And while there have been lots of very good books, I wanted to do it as a form of a story, right? As a form of a conversation, because most of our time we spend in conversations with ourselves, right? And so instead of being some abstract dry matter, I wondered what it would look like if it was a conversation between people asking some real questions and not settling for stock answers, right? Sometimes I think we are too agreeable in today's society, right? It's okay for us to disagree on a few things because it forces us to think through our points of view and say, let's say you and I don't agree on something. Say, Scott's a reasonable guy. I wonder why he feels this way. And this forces me to then think through it and say, hey, maybe he has a point there that I didn't recognize the first time around, right? But we tend to be in a hurry to be agreeable. And so what happens is that we miss the nuances of certain points of view. Science was like that, right? It wasn't a question of everybody agreeing on things. It was to put it to the test and everybody could take pot shots at it, So to me, that purpose led to say I wanted to do something which was long term, which lasted hopefully forever, and wasn't last 3 months and 6 months and so on. I mean, there was a time when I got a promotion, and when I got there, and I was so excited to get it, right? I mean, who wouldn't be, right? And then say, okay, that excited lasted a month, right? So while that had been my purpose the 3 years before, somehow the fruits of that labor, it didn't seem that sweet after a month, because now all I could see was perhaps some of the struggles and the pain and, the headaches I got to deal with and not necessarily the rewards, right? So I wanted something long-term, which lasted a while. So I started saying, I'm going to write a book. And this happened during COVID. And so I started writing a book, which I never thought I would. I've never thought of myself as an English major or didn't know where to put the question marks and the quotes and the commas and how to break up paragraphs. So that's why I sometimes tell people, if you look for purpose in what you love, you may be surprised that you may not love it while you're doing it, but you may grow to love it, right? Or it may be tedious work sometimes, but that may be part of a purpose, right? So for me, it manifested itself in writing the book and then talking to people about it and teaching them or answering questions or helping them, understand their path from that perspective.
We talked a little bit earlier before we recorded about some of the habits that you developed while you were writing the book, or some of the methods, some of the tools and techniques that helped you stay focused on the book and basically get the book done. Right. I'm wondering if you would share some of that with us, some of the methods or tools or techniques that you found useful in helping you, because I've talked to other people who wanted to write a book or were in the process of writing a book, and it's often a much bigger undertaking than people expect it to be. And one of the challenges is just doing the work to get it done. And I'm wondering, what were some of the ways that you were able to keep yourself focused and to be able to get that book written?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. So let me tell you what I started to do. And then I changed because I learned from my mistakes because it wasn't as effective, right? So I started to say I'm going to spend an hour a day, maybe 2 hours a day writing a book, because I figured it took that kind of work ethic to write a book. And then I found I only wrote once a week or once every other week because I didn't have 2 hours to write a book. Sometimes I didn't have an hour. I have family, 2 kids, busy. They were busy. I was busy. And so it was hard to find consistently an hour or 2 hours to do it. So I switched to saying I'm going to write every day, but for 15 minutes. So I found it a lot easier to find 15 minutes. Now, often that 15 minutes went on to a half an hour and an hour, because once I was into it, I was into a flow, and, no one wants to stop when we're in a flow, right? And so I often did get an hour's worth of productive time in on a daily basis. But I found I couldn't plan it that way. I had to plan for 15 minutes a day. And so what I focused on was being consistent rather than spending long amounts of time. Once I got consistent in that, I got a few chapters in. I found an editor because I realized I was, English is not my first language, so I in the parts of grammar that I struggled with, I didn't want to go and relearn grammar. I said I'd find an editor who's good at this. And shout out to Jessica, who helped me on getting the book to be more readable, and edit it. But once I had her on there, then that created an accountability partner in a sense. I didn't have a choice but to get certain things done in time. And because she was waiting on it to edit it, and then when she edited and gave it back to me, and I had to redo parts of it, I had to get it back in time so that, we could finalize things. So I think, being consistent on a daily basis, but with small periods of time rather than long, and finding someone we are accountable to makes it a lot easier to get things done on a daily basis.
It seems like there are a few common themes that we hear from people who are able to accomplish the things they want to accomplish. Like consistency is definitely one. Much better to tell yourself, I'm going to write for 15 minutes a day, and then actually do that, right, rather than set a goal. And I see people often do this. They set a goal that seems to be what they feel they need to do, and yet they're in reality not able to do that. And then all that does is lead to frustration, and often leads to people abandoning whatever that outcome is, rather than saying, let me start small with what I know I can do.
Right. To add on to that, I think often we play a part. What I mean by that is, let's say I want to be an author. Let me play the part of being an author, right? And the part of being an author means that I have ink all over my face, and that we have this image of what people who are an author need to look like, and then we try to live up to that image, right? But I think it's a habit. Writing is a habit. All of these is a habit. No, it's a question of developing these habits, right? And so when we quit looking at what the image we should portray and just focus on doing the work, it's a lot easier to do the work. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting because there may be certain cases where, for a very short period of time, there may be some inspiration that comes from, oh, let me live my life as if I was an author, right? But
Right.
that's not going to get the work done. Ultimately, we have to make the shift to, like you said, developing habits
Right.
and actually doing the work.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Einstein was, I think it was Einstein, maybe it was Edison, was famous for saying genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, right?
Yeah.
I think he overvalues genius. I mean, the inspiration part of it. It's all perspiration, right?
Yeah.
If I did it because I loved it, I would have taken 5 times as long to get the work done, right?
Yeah.
And this is why I think when people think of a purpose and they're often talking about feelings of purpose, right? How do I feel, right? Feelings by definition go up and down and they change. There is no such thing as a feeling which is consistent over 1 year or 2 years, right?
Yes.
And so that we had to develop the habits so that will carry us when we no longer feel the same way as when we made the original promise.
Yeah, what you're saying is almost exactly what you'll see in a book called Tiny Habits. I don't know if you've seen this book or read this book.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's written by B.J. Fogg, who is a professor at Stanford, and it's based on 20 years of behavioral research that he did. And basically, he at the beginning of the book, he says exactly the same thing that you're saying. Motivation is emotional. It's based on feelings, and our feelings change every day. So if we're relying on that to get the work done, it just makes it more difficult. Whereas if we develop achievable habits,
Right.
things that we can do consistently, then we're able to achieve whatever outcome we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing I added on to it is a not to do list, right? We talked about this earlier. I think the goal of purpose and creating habits is not this. Is not like if I'm juggling 8 plates, how do I juggle a ninth plate? Right? That's not the goal of it. Prioritization and creating habits. It's to say which 3 plates are worth juggling, so I don't have to juggle the remaining 5 or 6 plates, right? So it's actually taking things off the list. A lot of things are simply not worth doing, but we do it because it's either part of a previous habit that we haven't got rid of, or it's somebody else's problem which has somehow become our problem at this point. I think we look to see the work that I'm doing. Is it important, right? Who is it important for? Is it me? Is it my family? Is it my boss? Because obviously anyone who's working and has a boss is those things are going to be important. But if it's outside of that, what other people consider important doesn't necessarily need to be important for me. So that's one thing. The other thing is we often confuse urgent and important. So it may be urgent. I need it done today. Well, if you had not procrastinated on it, it would never have been urgent. We could have addressed it a long time ago and considered, is it even worth doing? Is it important or is it not important?
Yeah.
So in today's world, what I see is a lot of, and this I think is a COVID effect, a lot of people fill up their days with meetings. So there's Teams meetings and Zoom meetings, and then they have 9 and 10 meetings a day. I've had days where there's 9 and 10 meetings. I accomplished nothing. I've been in meetings, and especially if it's meetings with a large number of people, then less gets accomplished, right? So do I have to get on every meeting? Can I? If either I don't get anything out of it or I can contribute nothing into the meeting, then maybe I don't need to be in the meeting. I'll save myself and then 1 hour of my time and I'll go do something useful with it. Once we start dropping stuff and say, I don't need to do this, then I think that simplifies life quite a bit, saying that I have time to do important things. It's trying to do everything, which is the problem.
Yeah, it's trying to do everything, which is the problem. That's exactly what seems to be the case so often. And I think you're the first person who I heard use the term not to-do list. And I really love that. I think that's an awesome way to think about it. But even it's interesting to even hear the way that came out when you were talking about writing your book. One of the things you talked about was hiring an editor. I mean, you could have gone and gotten a bachelor's degree in English if you wanted to. You could have made the change to be able to edit that yourself. Right. But realizing if I hand this job off to somebody else, then I can do the part that is most important for me to do, I can do that much more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it's a focus on core competency, right? Only I could write the book, but anybody could edit the book, right? Now, obviously, I found a good editor, but it didn't have to be me who was editing the book, right?
Right.
It's the same with marketing it. I could try marketing it myself because it's, let's say, it's cheaper and try and do everything on my own, or I can find somebody who's competent in marketing, and I don't have to spend 2 years trying to understand how marketing a book works, So often I think the reason we don't have time is we take our time in doing things that we perfectly well could ask somebody else to do. We may have to pay them to do it, right? Which is where the reluctance comes in often. But it's well worth our time. I mean, our time at some point is more precious than the money that it costs to find someone who could do it. Now, I do think if it's done in the context of work, where we may have people on our team and say, look, I don't need to do this work. I can delegate it to someone else to do the work. There needs to be a balance that what we delegate to them is not just the worst tasks, right, that we don't want to do, but sometimes the best tasks, right? Sometimes the things which bring them visibility, that brings them success, right? And just as long as they know how to do it. So we may have to spend some time in getting them to that point, right? But eventually, and I'm sure we'll talk about it as we go along, as we build teams and we are looking to say, how do we build high performing teams? It can be delegating the worst tasks only. It is getting them the recognition and not just us, right? So it's like I was listening to, what's his name, Nikola Jokic, the Denver Nuggets NBA fan, say somebody asked him, why do you like to assist somebody else on scoring a point rather than scoring a point yourself? He said, if I score a point, one person is happy. If I give an assist, two people are happy, right? And I thought that was a great insight by a basketball player, and that works at work as well, in our jobs.
Yeah, and I think we're making a nice transition into another topic that it would be interesting to discuss with you, which is leadership and teamwork, because you have extensive experience and success in building and leading effective teams. One of the things you talked about was delegating. I love what you were just saying. It's not necessarily just handing off the things that you don't want to do, but also you talked about having to invest time in making sure that people are able to do the jobs that you expect them to do.
Right.
I think this is so important because so many people who end up in leadership roles, we were talking about this earlier, end up in those roles because they were successful as an individual contributor.
Right.
They're good at doing the job. And yet when the job becomes leading other people, that's totally different.
Right.
So I'm wondering, were there any challenges that you faced as you developed as a leader? Some of the important things that you learned along the way that other maybe new leaders might benefit from?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's so many things, obviously, right? A few that I know, but undoubtedly it's a universe in itself, and we can talk for a day on just this topic, Yeah. As an individual contributor, I was interested and I felt I was getting promoted for being the smartest guy in the room, right? As a leader, I found that if I was the smartest guy in the room, the business simply would not grow. Had to surround myself with people who were smarter than I was. I obviously brought something to the table, so they looked at me as competent and not that, who made this guy the leader, right? But I had to surround myself by people who were subject matter experts in their areas. And so I had to look at it as building a team of leaders rather than a team of followers. Most people, especially in their first managerial job, tend to value loyalty of followers, right? Because they themselves little unsure in their job. I know I was, right? And so they want the loyalty of people around them and, to build their own confidence in themselves as a manager or a leader. But if they look at it as saying, I want to build leaders, I want to build people who will do things faster than me, better than me, and I will help them grow. It's almost like a parent-child kind of relationship. I'm not saying our employees are children, but I'm saying when I look at my son and I look at my daughter, I want them to do things better than me, faster than me, more successfully than I did, right? So in that sense, I think it is first having a vision that I'm putting together a team of leaders, not a team of followers. And secondly, I think it's realizing that different people have different ways of growing in that to become a leader, right? So, for example, the first guy I hired, his name is Conrad, and Conrad was very much like me. He if we given a task, then he would say, "Okay, I'll go figure this out. I'll make this successful." I just needed to check in with him if the task was successful, and it invariably was. And when it was successful, he showed me that it was successful, and this was great. I didn't need to micromanage him. I trusted him to take on things, and he did things every time, right? But I found out that the second person I hired expected more, right? And so I didn't realize that. It took me 2 years to realize that this person actually wanted greater structure, greater definition of what the task was, more check-ins, more validation of ideas, more encouragement. And we all need the encouragement and validation of ideas at some point, right? It could be VP or CEO, or at some point you need some validation of certain ideas. It's just that different people need different levels of it. And it was not until 2 years later when I got feedback that, hey, here is what I'm looking for. Otherwise, it creates a lot of stress in my job. Then I realized this person was different from me or Conrad, no less intelligent, no less competent. In fact, in some ways, more intelligent, but just that needed a different structure in which to grow. So now that was hard for me because that wasn't natural to me, right? But leadership is not natural. Nobody is born a leader. You have to grow into it, right? Mm-hmm. So then I had to start establishing a more structure, more definition, more feedback. And so with some people, you can delegate tasks and results, and they'll come back. With some people, you can delegate only subtasks, while the overall ownership of the results has to stay with me until they're comfortable taking all of that on. But how fast somebody moves in this journey has nothing to do with how good of a leader they could be later on, right? It's just they're often younger, earlier on in their career, and so they need that mentorship and guidance to get to the point where they will be great leaders.
Yeah, it sounds like some of what you're saying, especially maybe what our natural tendencies are when we first become leaders, when someone first gets into a leadership role, it seems to relate back to what you were saying about agreeableness, right? Like as a leader, it's very convenient for me if the people working for me are very agreeable.
Right.
And it's also very convenient if they think similar to the way I think, if we're all approaching things in a similar way. And yet that's not necessarily effective. I love the way you talk about creating a team of leaders, not creating a team of followers. And if you're creating a team of leaders, you're going to have people who will push back, right, who will disagree with you. Hopefully it's all respectful disagreements, but similar to what we see in science where people are going to challenge each other and politely, respectfully disagree with each other and push back. Right. And that creates momentum. It creates growth. It creates an opportunity for us to all better ourselves.
Absolutely. And, I multiple times have been able to be part of rapid growths, right? I'll like to use the term an entrepreneur, someone who within a business is essentially takes overall responsibility for growing a business, right? And not an entrepreneur, not on their own, but an entrepreneur. So you're not worried about funding and all that, but you are focused on saying, if it's going to grow, I'm going to have to step up and help it grow, right? And in that process, what I realized is it's the guys who are perhaps the most disagreeable or challenging who are the most useful as well, right? Because they see things I don't see. And if everybody sees only what I see, we don't see anything new. So we're limited to what I know, which I know is not everything. But when they can challenge and we can discuss and sometimes argue over it, and sometimes we want to throw things at each other's head, right? But we know we respect each other's expertise and say, there is validity to this point of view. Whether or not I think it's the most important thing, I'll put it away at the back of my mind and ponder over it when I'm not emotional over this topic. And then you find out these people are the bloodline. I mean, they're the lifeline of the company. I mean, they think of things nobody else thinks of. They do things without being asked to do things. And it's like, hey, where have you been? How can I hire more people like you? Right?
Yeah. It's such an interesting shift to make, I think, from the initial, maybe instinctive way we would like to leading a bunch of people who are going to be agreeable and easy to work with, to make that shift to be able to value the people who, in some ways, yes, they're more challenging,
Right.
but yet that relationship of challenging each other and recognizing what those people have to contribute and being able to be an effective leader for those people. It reminds me of something that a guy told me once. He was a general manager at this organization, was talking about one of the people who worked for him. And he said, let's just say Joe is the name of the employee that this guy was talking about. And he said, the problem with Joe is he wants me to like him. And I don't like him, but I'll always help him.
No, it's such a great point. Some guys I don't like, or there's sometimes that I don't like them, or sometimes I don't like their behavior. And sometimes I wish they'd just shut up, right? But sometimes those are the most valuable conversations. Right now, I don't think you can have an organization which is continuously like that, because then, people don't want to talk to each other. There's too much rancor. It's just not pleasant, right? But I think that a level of conflict should be encouraged. Alternate points of view and arguing over something should be encouraged. I think it makes us better, especially if you're looking to grow business very fast. And what I've found is it doesn't take a lot of people to grow business. The times I've been part of it, and it was not that I grew the business, but I was part of a team which worked together to grow the business. But it was only 3 people. And it only takes 3 or 4 people to have a vision and say, if we work together, we can grow this part of the business. We don't need 100 people. In fact, if you get 100 people on board, you'll slow down everything, because it'll become an act in agreement and getting everybody to say the same thing. And you'll be so focused on getting things to be agreeable, you'll never try risky things, right? And so I found that a group of 3, given a focus and given the freedom to go do things, can do some tremendous things within organizations. The thing is, the 3 people have to have, I believe, some overlapping skill sets, not the exact same thing, but perhaps some overlapping ones where they can speak the same language, but they all bring something new to the team as well. And they really should have a mindset that I may be about once a year in a position where I may be fired. Right? Because you're trying new things. Things don't happen as fast as you want. No one knows how to plan, right? Because how do you plan something which can grow 500% or negative 10%? I mean, both of them are possible when you're trying something risky. So it does require a mindset to say, I'm willing to take those risks, not ridiculous risks, but some measured risks. But I don't know if it'll come off in a year or 2. Sometimes it takes 3 years. I think it takes 3 years for a business to scale. At least at the times I've seen it, it's taken 3 years. A year of sowing seeds, right? And hoping you're doing the right thing, maybe getting a client or 2 who's starting to buy into your vision. Then you start scaling in the year 2, at least within the client and some other clients. And year 3 is where you see the S curve and, potential for dramatic growth. So it takes time, and it takes that mindset to say, I'll give people the time. I'm part of it. I'll try to make it faster, but we all know it's going to take some time. And, we want this kind of a relationship within the team where they can argue with each other, but at the end of the day, we'll move forward together.
That sounds like it relates in a way to what you were saying, or what we were discussing earlier about realistic expectations. Just like saying, hey, I can only spend 15 minutes a day on this, so let me plan for that and see how that goes. Same thing, having the vision or the wisdom maybe to realize that some things aren't going to happen just in a year, that they take longer. That seems like 2 sides of the same coin of having realistic expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've never seen anything grow faster than 3 years. I'm talking about dramatic growth. If you want to go 10x growth, you're lucky if it happens in 3 years. It might take 10 years, right? But it's not going to happen before 3 years. What happens with a lot of organizations is they're looking year on year growth, and they keep changing directions every year, right? And so then what happens is they have not yet done something long enough to see the results. And before that, they've changed directions and are going on in a different direction. So it's important, I think, to build relationships not only within the small team, right, but also higher up in the organization and across the organization, so that the goal of the team doesn't change on a yearly basis. We give it sufficient time for it to reap some rewards. And it also stresses out every other part of the organization. So I'm in the software business, which means anything we do I lead up pre-sales for part of the organization, and anything we do impacts the R&D teams and other teams, right? So we know that it creates stress and pressure in there. So how do these teams move together rather than getting into internal problems? So it is important, I think, to develop those relationships both upwards as well as sideways across the organization, saying, here's what we're trying to do. It may grow very fast. As we grow very fast, all parts of the organizations are going to have to be able to scale, right? And give them their victories too. Obviously, it stresses them out, and when they come through, right, it's easy to focus on me and say, hey, look what I did. I was able to grow the business. But the reality is, if they hadn't picked up what they needed to, we would have failed, right? And give them those victories, right, and showcase those victories.
You're talking now about building relationships, which is so valuable in any kind of endeavor, really, anything we do in life and in work. And it seems to be worthwhile to be aware of the difference between building a relationship and being friendly, right? Like, because I'm someone, I've worked in situations where I felt like I was very good friends with the people I worked with, and I really enjoyed that. But there are going to be times when you're going to disagree. There are going to be times when you're going to be, maybe yelling at each other, feeling like throwing things at each other, and that's okay. And so being able to build a strong relationship without feeling like you said, like we just need to be agreeable all the time, that's not really building a strong relationship.
No, it's a building a friendship. And if you want to go have coffee together or play tennis together, that's great, right? I think in the kind of jobs we do, we expect a high level of performance and competence from people. And so if we don't see that, well, we may be friends for coffee, we're not even going to be friends for tennis.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, and you take it to the work level and say, hey, I do expect people to work, the performance of the team to be high. But if it's not high, and invariably through a process of trying to grow stuff, there are going to be areas where somebody's is not high. There needs to be a process where you can have a very frank conversation and say, we are friends. I'm committed to helping you become better, but I expect you to become better. Now you tell me, what is it going to take to get there? Sometimes that works. Sometimes they may simply not be that good in that area. I mean, if I'm looking for somebody analytical to explain quantum mechanics to me, and they just don't know quantum mechanics that well, then it's a problem, right? And so I had to find someone else who can explain it to me and not get so stuck with the relationship and say, I'm willing to let go of the entire mission for the sake of that friendship. I'll still keep the friendship, but I say, look, I need someone who can get deeper into this. I'm going to find someone who's going to help me in this area,
Yeah. And when we talk about building quality relationships, and this seems to apply in the work relationships that we have, but also even in things like family relationships, it seems like the key, and several things you've mentioned have touched on this, the key is communication. Like if we really want quality relationships, we need to look at the way we're communicating. You talked earlier about understanding the way different people work and how much supervision they need, and whether they're going to take something and run with it or whether you're going to need to give it to them piece by piece. And so learning how to communicate with different people effectively so that you can lead them in a way that will allow them to produce their best. I'm wondering if there are any methods that you've found that are really effective in helping you understand how someone communicates or how the best way to communicate with another person that you're working with.
Seeing how they say things and seeing how they hear things And so, for example, if some people I found out really want recognition, all right?
Mm-hmm.
And if they do something but they're not recognized, they feel slighted, or they feel like, hey, I did so much, and you didn't even bother to tell me that I did a great job, right?
Mm-hmm.
While others, and this is especially true of kids, I think, is sometimes we encourage them and praise them, saying you did such a great job over here, and what we think we're doing is encouraging them, and what they feel is pressure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if we take saying, hey, look at what your friend did. Hey, what a great job he did. And we think we're being supportive of them and their friends. And what they think is, you're telling me that I haven't done as good a job as my friend did. Or they feel this undue pressure, right? So I think part of it is to learn, how do I say something to someone without it creating negative pressure on them. Maybe there's a level of positive pressure regarding urgency of things and when things need to get done. But if they're working under a negative pressure, most people make mistakes under negative pressure. They can't think clearly, right? It's not their subconscious mind which is making decisions. Now consciously they're trying to do stuff. It's like trying to ride a bicycle consciously, pedal movement after pedal movement, and you're more likely to make mistakes. And so it is to understand what is of value to them. How do they hear what I'm saying, right? That you can usually see that by their behavior and their demeanor when we tell them something, right? If they look like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders, then I think I'm helping them. They think, oh, I got so much more pressure now to do stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then to back it off and perhaps take the responsibility of the results on my shoulders and saying, look, I'm going to take responsibility of how this gets done. I'm going to look through all the work and make sure it is at the standard I want. I just want you to focus on thinking of creative ways to do this. I'll take on the responsibility of ensuring it is ready for prime time, right? So then they know that they're not the ultimate person responsible before it gets in front of somebody important, right, in their minds. And so I will take on that responsibility. So I think it is actually taking a lot of time trying to understand them and not trying to force fit them into our way of thinking. If somebody is a very charismatic leader, they actually have this fault, perhaps, or this drawback where everybody listens to their words and they're hanging on to everything they say. And there's a tendency to think I'm communicating and people are getting it and everybody's on the same page. Really, what they're maybe doing is creating a lot of stress and a lot more mistakes being made. So it may be talking a little bit less, listening a lot more, understanding the problem behind the problem, right? I mean, people may tell you this is my problem, but if you dig into it, something else may be the problem. And so digging into it long enough to know what is the real problem and helping them address that. In some ways, I think it's the most enriching part of our lives to say I was able to help someone overcome something that they were struggling with.
Yeah.
But it's hard work, right? Obviously. And it is, we have to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions and say, hey, this is what worked with Conrad. Hence, it must work with anyone else who comes down the pipeline. And they will all react the same way because I think that's the right way to react.
Until we really dig into it a little and learn more about communication and how it works, it's very common to think that communicating is all about what we say.
Right.
And really, so a crucial part of communication is what we're hearing and what we're seeing. And that applies so well to leadership as well with what you're saying. That's such an important part of leadership, not what we say as a leader, but what are we noticing? What are we seeing? What are we hearing? And using that information to shape the way that we interact with people.
Right. Exactly. And, I think it's also important to know people because sometimes people feel this person knows me, so I trust them to hear what I'm saying, right? And so in the world of Teams and Zoom, sometimes the conversations are transactional. You and me are doing something, Scott, and I just need to know enough for us to complete this together. Well, we are not paused for us to know each other. I don't know where you live. I don't know what you do. I don't know about your family. And I don't know about the pressures you may be going through, But if I had an inkling of an understanding of where you're coming from, then perhaps we can find some common ground and be a lot more productive, and without it creating a lot of stress on you or on me. So I sometimes think we don't take enough time to do it because our relationship can be transactional.
Well, and it's easy to focus on, especially I think for a lot of people, I find this for myself, it's very easy for me to focus on what I'm doing and just what the tasks are and let's get that done rather than focusing on the communication and the relationships, which is so much more valuable in many cases.
Right. And the tasks are important too. It's just that it has its place in the pecking order, so to speak, right? I think we start with the vision, we start with the relationships, and then at some point the habits and the tasks and all that are important. It's just, it cannot be the foundation of a relationship, I think.
Right. Well, Ganesh, I'm very grateful for your time today. I think there will be quite a bit in here that people can benefit from, whether they're leaders or whether they're trying to accomplish things on their own, like writing a book. There's a question that I ask people at the end of every one of these episodes, and I'd like to ask you right now, which is, what is your dream right now?
That's a great question. And I see that very cunningly you didn't give me that question up front. So I'm going to have to think on my feet here. So, we talked about purpose and impact, right? I'd like that purpose and impact to be long-term and it to be a lot of people. When I think of impact, I think of it as meaningful impact, not just fluffy impact, So, for example, I could make a TikTok video, which is funny and a lot of people can laugh about it, but that lasts 20 seconds. And even if 1 million people watched it, and it may be a great source of revenue, that doesn't mean that much to me as a lifelong purpose. So I'd like what I'm doing here with science and with faith and those questions which revolve around those. I'd like to have a meaningful impact in people's lives with that. As they have questions, I'd like to be able to be along with them and help them find answers. It's not as much I think I will give them the answers. It's their journey. I think they will find the answers, and my goal is to help them think through different aspects of it and look at the same question through various eyes, in a sense, and say, what makes sense given all this, So I'd like to impact a lot of people in a meaningful way. I'm probably a little better at impacting people one-on-one than in a big group of people. So that's my dream. If I can impact a lot of people to ask those questions, find those answers, and start their own journeys, then I think that is my dream.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for the time, Scott. I appreciate it. It's a great conversation, and I appreciate the time from you, the time on your show. It's a great show. I've listened to many of your podcasts, so it's great to be on here.
Ganesh's book is titled Let Me Into Heaven: 3 Computer Scientists Find Their Way to Life. You can learn more about the book at letmeintoheaven.com. You can find Ganesh on Twitter at cause_first. Ganesh is also on LinkedIn and Instagram, and we will include those links in the show notes for this episode so that you can find them more easily. If you're a leader who wants to improve your ability to delegate, if you want to improve other crucial time management skills that can help you be a more effective leader, if you want to improve your ability to manage teams of people who think and work in different ways, I would love to help you with that. I'm a certified leadership and executive coach. I have extensive experience leading high-performing teams of highly skilled and experienced professionals. I love helping leaders learn to use their time more effectively and discover more enjoyment and satisfaction in their work. Check out my website, scottmillercoaching.com, or send me an email. My address is scott@scottmillercoaching.com. If you're wondering what my dogs are doing, they're sleeping on the couch. But it's almost dinner time, so I'm expecting a big goofy boxer to walk in here any minute and give me a sad look. Remember to like, subscribe, or follow us. We have more great episodes coming up for you soon. Take care.